On November the 3rd, the non-profit World Preservation Foundation co-hosted with Dodds Parliamentary Services a unique gathering at the historic Central Hall, Westminster in London, with speakers from government, science, media and advocacy organisations to discuss the increasingly evident effects of climate change and explain how the production of food, and in particular livestock grazing, is seriously impacting global warming, biodiversity loss, water shortages and more. Leaders Preserving Our Future, Pace and Priorities on Climate Change was attended by experts and dignitaries such as the Duchess of Norfolk, High Commissioner for Antigua and Barbuda, Dr. Carl Roberts, Dr. Esther van der Voort, a representative from the United Nations Environment Programme, and the ambassadors of such countries as Russia, Bolivia, Nepal and others. The highlight of the afternoon was the presence of Supreme Master Ching Hai, who delivered a message via video on solving the large environmental crisis of concern in the meeting, as well as urging leaders and co-citizens alike to make courageous, earth-saving changes. We now invite you to join us for Part 7 of the 7-part rebroadcast of the live conference Leaders Preserving Our Future, Pace and Priorities on Climate Change on November the 3rd, 2010 in Westminster, London in the United Kingdom.
The challenge of change on a global level can be great, but the benefits do not only provide great motivation, but also to the answer to many of the crises facing us. Our next speaker, Dr. Patrick Brown, is a professor of biochemistry at the Stanford University School of Medicine in California, USA. He's received numerous awards, including the American Cancer Society's Medal of Honor, and is elected member of the United States National Academy of Sciences and its Institute of Medicine. So please put your hands together for Patrick Brown.
Well, first of all, I want to thank the WPF and the organizers for inviting me to this meeting and putting it together. I've certainly learned a tremendous amount today. It's hard to really add much to what we've already heard. I'm going to try to slip in a couple of sort of factual points. One of the challenges that we have to wrestle with when we talk about making possible changes to diet or agriculture for environmental reasons is that we still need to feed the world population. And those animals that humans are raising for food, they make up about 20% of the biomass, the animal biomass on the surface of the planet, and feeding them requires more than 30% of the land area of the planet. Now, one of the corollaries of devoting 30% of the surface of the planet to raising animals is that historically, land that was covered with forest or scrubland or savanna or prairies had to be cleared so that it could be used for grazing or crop cultivation to produce feed crops to feed the animals. And this is a map showing the areas that have been converted, again, from their original vegetation to farmlands for cultivating crops. The red and yellow represents areas where feed crops are the primary crops being raised. And you can see that in most of the developed world in the northern hemisphere, the crop cultivation isn't crops to feed humans, it's to feed that huge population of animals that we bring along with us. In order to produce that land for farming and grazing, clearing of the land released a massive amount of carbon into the atmosphere that was originally in the plant biomass and in the soils. 150 billion metric tons historically. Each year, as of this year, we produce about 9 billion metric tons of carbon released into the atmosphere by burning fossil fuels. So Basically, if you do the math, simple math, the historical land use change amounts to the greenhouse gas equivalent of 17 years' worth of fossil fuel emissions. The portion of that land that was cleared for animal farming represents 12 to 13 years' worth of fossil fuel emissions. And the happy ending is that what this means is actually a point that wasn't really addressed when we talk about the need for rapidly doing something that will address greenhouse gases not over the next 100 years but over the next decade or two. This provides a means for very rapid actual reduction of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And the opportunity is sort of illustrated by this graph that you've probably seen 100 times. And every time you look at it, the striking thing is it's just shooting up. This represents atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations over a period of 30 or so years. That's what draws your eye. But what I want to focus on is that it's not continuously going up. In fact, every year during the spring and summer in the northern hemisphere, where there's the greatest amount of vegetation, the carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere shoot down, actually very rapidly. Basically, that's because plants convert carbon dioxide into biomass, and we have, by clearing land for agriculture, there's a huge opportunity cost in terms of that activity. Any land that we allow to recover its normal vegetation will immediately be soaking up CO2 and converting it into biomass and soil carbon stores. Effectively, the problem here is that these periods where the CO2 is being pulled out of the air are more than matched by CO2 generated by burning fossil fuels. But if we could take advantage of this CO2 lowering ability by allowing more lands to convert CO2 into biomass, that would allow potentially a very rapid lowering of CO2 concentrations. And we have, effectively, you could say, if we took all the land that was currently used for animal farming and immediately just said, let it revert to its native cover, effectively we would get like 12 years worth of complete negating the carbon dioxide rises from fossil fuel burning. And of course there's the methane story, which you already heard a lot about. Now, when I talk about this subject with my colleagues, first question I always get is, well, even if you could imagine that happening, then you'd have the problem of producing enough protein to feed the world, and that would probably require more land to be cleared for farming. Well, that's actually nonsense. It turns out that the current world production of just 4 crops, soybeans, corn, wheat, and rice, that require less than 4% of the Earth's surface area to produce, contain more protein and calories than all human beings eat today every year, and way more protein and calories than they need to eat, but that's another story. So there's an interesting opportunity, replacing meat with plant-derived sources of proteins to the degree that you could reduce the land area required to feed the human population and allow recovery of biodiversity and carbon capture ability. Reduce it by more than 80%. In other words, we'd recover about 25% of the total surface area of the planet we'd get back for whatever purposes we wanted to use it, carbon capture or solar energy or recreation or just leaving it alone and letting it grow. That's a lot of land. Okay. So you don't need any meat or dairy products to completely satisfy the nutritional needs of the entire human population with current production. This is just last year, the American Dietetic Association, which is sort of the scientific organization studies nutrition in the U.S., had a position paper that stated that vegetarian diets, including vegan diets, are healthful, nutritionally adequate, may provide health benefits, and that's true for every stage of the life cycle, including pregnancy, lactation, infancy, athletes, you name it, no problem. This is actually a wonderfully researched and written paper in Climate Change last year that modeled the economics of mitigating CO2 or other greenhouse gases to reach the target stabilization pathway that's more or less internationally agreed upon, even though no one's really doing anything about it. But the point that they make is that if you eliminated all animal foods from the diet, you would save 80% of the cost of stabilizing CO2 at the level that most governments, I think including the UK, have accepted as a reasonable target. And that amounts to tens of billions of dollars saved for the global economy. So you're actually talking about something that is a pocketbook issue for your constituents. Is it realistic? You already heard a reference to the kind of historical model of tobacco smoking. Basically, what happened about 50 years ago was slowly society, including the political powers that be, accepted that smoking actually had a net deleterious effect on the welfare of their societies and decided to take a variety of strategic actions to reduce smoking, the most effective of which I think pretty much everyone agrees are increasing the cost of it by raising taxes and making it harder to do by restricting places where you can smoke and so forth. But at any rate, the effect has been to take something that actually I think has a lot of parallels to meat eating. Namely, it's a completely unnecessary, but for many people very pleasurable habit that people are reluctant to give up. And another parallel is it's supported by a very powerful industry with very powerful lobbies, and probably in the British Parliament, certainly in the US Congress, that will do just about anything to try to prevent change. Nevertheless, it worked. Basically, I think that plant-based foods are more than an order of magnitude cheaper to produce nutritionally equivalent products than meat. It would be relatively easy to make it more economically advantageous for people to change their diets. And the last thing I want to mention is sort of another little economics thing, which is that one of the most price-sensitive purchases that consumers make is purchases of meat, meaning that I think raising the price would have a real incentive effect for people's diets and for industries to develop, to provide alternative foods that people could afford.
Our next speaker is Anthony Cleanthus. What are some of the practical steps we can take to bring about sustainable consumption, and how can governments and industry facilitate this? Anthony Cleanthus is a senior policy advisor on sustainable business and economics at the WWF. He is founder of the sustainability consultancy Here Tomorrow and a registered advisor to the UK government's Foreign and Commonwealth Office. Please put your hands together.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I know you've had a lot of data thrown at you today, a lot of information, and it's a very complex and very difficult issue fraught with dilemmas, I think, this whole question of eating less meat. And as a meat lover myself, I do recognise that it's a very hard thing to countenance, this idea that we all need to change our diets. But we do. It's very important that we eat less meat. And I'm going to begin with just a couple of charts going right back up to the top and explaining why we need to take a systemic view on this, not just to look at the way that we produce what we consume, but to ask ourselves, are we consuming the right things, and are we handling the things that we consume in the right kind of way, and what do we need to do to change? So I'll move on to talk a little bit about what the impacts of foods consumption are, if you haven't heard enough of that already. And finally, to talk about some of the responses and priorities that I believe we as a society should be placing, and what we can expect from our politicians. I think the problem here is that our consumption of food, of fossil fuels, of many of the things that we consider essential for daily life is actually eating up our own planet. If this room were full of bankers, I'd be talking about principles and loans, and everybody has savings. What we are doing is we are spending our savings. We are not living off the interest that those savings accrue.